Welcome to Heresies Through History. We're going to begin this discussion of heresy with a simple question. What is heresy? Heresy comes from a Greek word, Heresies, which means choice. Now, we're often taught that choice is a good thing. It's nice to have a choice. But in the case of doctrine, choice is a bad thing. This is choice where there should not be a choice, because choice involves departing in some way from what God has given. Choice is the opposite here of reception. So instead of just receiving God's word with faith, the heretic chooses to believe something different about God's word. It's kind of like Eve choosing to eat the forbidden fruit. Now, heresy is the willful and persistent rejection of any article of faith by a baptized member of the church. So heresy is not ignorance. That's important. It is rather that one has made a choice against what God has said and then refuses to be corrected, persistently holds on to it, willfully, and will not change. Ignorance is different. Ignorance just means you don't know. And oftentimes people will be ignorant of various things in the faith, but they won't make a choice against them. So why is heresy dangerous? This is what Paul says. Take a moment to read this. Now, why, according to Paul, is heresy dangerous? Several reasons. First, he says it causes divisions in the church and offenses. The divisions are caused when people must argue over what is the truth, as opposed to simply holding on to the apostolic doctrine, and the offenses come by the sins that are committed against one another in the midst of that fight. This often causes people to leave the church. The heretics do not serve Christ, Paul says, but they serve their own belly. By that it means they're gaining something from this. They're looking out for their own reputation, their own fame, perhaps their own income. So they sound good. They sound reasonable, often. But they do it to deceive people. Jesus himself says these words in Matthew 24. What do we see here? The heretics are deceivers. They are people who are not sent by God, false prophets, because they're speaking words other than God's words. And on account of their teaching, lawlessness abounds, it says here. That could be either lawlessness in terms of following God's word, or lawlessness in terms of God's moral law. And we'll see examples of both of those as we go through the various heresies of the early church. As a result of these things, it says the love of many will grow cold. People will lose faith. St. Paul says this in Galatians 5. Take a moment to read it. So according to St. Paul, the heretics not only are deceivers, they do so because of selfish ambitions. They cause dissensions, again, that's divisions in the church, and they won't enter heaven. That's the big thing. Heresy leads to hell. St. Peter writes this. Peter says heresy causes destruction. Causes destruction of the faith of the individual, destruction of the unity of church, and finally the destruction of the heretics and their followers eternally. Because it says here their destruction does not slumber. So the question for us is, what are we as a church to do? There have been many answers to that. Some have said, let's burn the heretics. Well, that's not really what the scriptures say. Take a moment, go ahead and pause the recording if you need to, and read the following passages. So to sum up what we've just read, there are several things that we are to do and not to do. First of all, we are not to listen to the heretics. Second, we're to try to correct them, rebuke their errors, confront them, and especially we're to defend the truth. The third thing, we're not to have fellowship with them. They're excommunicated. They are not allowed in our churches anymore because of the divisions they cause and the harm they do to believers. And the most important thing that we must do is build ourselves up in the faith. We must study God's word so that we know the truth, so that we are not deceived. So why does it matter? Because the devil wants you. The devil wants to devour you. And this is the way he goes about doing it. Now we're going to do a super quick flyby of the major heresies of the first 4 centuries, what they taught, why those teachings are dangerous. The first 2 heresies we're going to look at are the Judaizers and the Gnostics. The Judaizers. What did they teach?
Everybody was kung fu fighting.
No, they didn't teach jiu-jitsu. They taught something far more dangerous than a martial art that can only hurt the body. They taught something that could teach the soul. Jesus called them the synagogue of Satan in Revelation. And elsewhere they're described in the scriptures as being disciples of James the Just, the Bishop of Jerusalem. But James himself disowns them and does not say that they're his followers. So what did they teach? They taught Christians must keep some of the Old Testament ceremonial laws. Now, you couldn't keep all of the ceremonial laws of the Old Testament if you were a Christian because, frankly, there is no temple. So you couldn't do many of the pilgrimage feasts. You couldn't do sacrifices. But the ones that you could keep, they taught you ought to keep. In other words, you had to be a good Jew first before you could be a good Christian. So what were some of those? Well, the main ones that we find being addressed in the scriptures are these. Circumcision. The 8th-day ceremony that brought one into the kingdom of Israel. So they said, as I said before, you have to become a Jew first. You must be circumcised if you're going to be a true Christian. And the second was that you could only eat certain foods. You had to be kosher. You should not eat the Gentile foods. You should only eat the foods approved by Moses in the Old Testament. Those foods were intended to keep the Jews separate from the peoples around them. And this is heresy. So what's wrong with that? Paul says that we aren't justified by keeping these works. And in fact, that if we say we have to keep works, we've basically undone the gospel. That we're not saved by what Jesus did, but we're saved by what we do. And that's a heresy. The next group, the Gnostics, you're somewhat familiar with. What did they teach? Well, first of all, they taught that God is completely unknowable. He exists in another realm, way far away from all other beings, and all emanations from him, all things that come from him, do not know him. He's unapproachable, unknowable, hidden. Second, they taught that this God did not create the physical world, and that creation is a work of a lesser being, one of the eons who proceeded from God, or who emanated from God. And they say, because of this creation, some people have a little bit of God trapped in their bodies, and that's the light that you see them hidden. So the goal of this faith is to discover and free this divine spark or this divine light that's within you, to set it free. Physical things, according to the Gnostics, hinder the spiritual things. They get in the way. Remember, the body is a trap. So to get true spirituality, true knowledge, you have to transcend your body in some way. Because the body isn't important, there's no such thing as sin. What you do with your body doesn't matter. And Jesus is not God, doesn't even know the true God, because remember, he's completely unknowable, but somehow opens this path of secret knowledge so that you can free your divine spark. What's wrong with that? Well, it's heresy.